In the golden age of Athens, while Socrates debated virtue in the agora and Phidias carved gods from marble, children screamed in the shadows of those same gleaming columns. This is not the sanitized Greece of popular history. This is the Greece that dedicated classical scholars have often relegated to hushed footnotes, if mentioned at all. We celebrate Greek democracy, philosophy, and art, praising their profound contributions to Western civilization, their relentless pursuit of beauty and truth. But beneath this gleaming veneer of cultural achievement festered a system of exploitation so normalized, so deeply entrenched in the social fabric, that even the brightest minds of the era remained blind to its inherent depravity. The sexual exploitation of young boys, particularly those of slave status, was not merely tolerated, it was perversely institutionalized. These were not isolated incidents or aberrations. This was systematic abuse cloaked in the guise of mentorship and education. The Greeks had a word for it: pederasty, a term that no euphemism can cleanse of its true nature, the commodification of children's bodies for the gratification of privileged men. Today, as we unearth mass graves of discarded infants and meticulously decipher the unspoken truths embedded within ancient texts, we are compelled to confront an agonizing reality. The civilization we credit with fathering democracy also perfected a system of child sexual slavery that would persist for centuries. And, perhaps most disturbingly, they managed to convince themselves, and attempted to convince history, that it was somehow virtuous. This documentary pulls back the curtain on the hidden world of boy concubines in classical Greece. We will meticulously dissect how economic desperation, the spoils of military conquest, and rigid social hierarchies converge to create a thriving market for children. We will listen for the haunting echoes of their suffering preserved within the fragmented historical records that dared to acknowledge their existence, and we will unflinchingly ask ourselves, how fundamentally different are we from those who walked the sun-drenched streets of ancient Athens? For every Plato who meticulously crafted theories of ideal forms, there existed countless unnamed boys whose sole ideal was to simply survive until the dawn of the next day. Their story demands to be told, not for the sake of sensationalizing the past, but to sharpen our awareness and ensure we recognize exploitation, regardless of how convincingly it might be masked by the veneer of civilization. Steel yourself. This descent into history's most chilling darkness begins now. The bustling slave markets of Piraeus throbbed with activity every day, save for sacred festival holidays. Here, amidst the briny sea air mingling with the suffocating stench of human despair, children as young as 7 were paraded on crude wooden platforms, subjected to the invasive scrutiny of prospective buyers who examined their teeth, muscles, and overall physical potential. But for certain boys, those deemed exceptionally beautiful or possessing a delicate allure, a far more sinister fate awaited. In the clandestine specialized markets that catered specifically to Athens' most perverse sexual appetites, the economics were chillingly brutal in their cold simplicity. While a healthy adult male slave might fetch around 200 drachmas, equivalent to roughly 6 months' wages for a skilled craftsman, a beautiful, unblemished boy could command prices soaring to 500 drachmas or even higher. The most prized specimens, those possessing fair, unblemished skin, perfectly symmetric features, and what the Greeks poetically termed proper proportions, could fetch prices that would comfortably purchase a modest family home. Poverty served as the relentless engine that fueled this horrific trade. Desperate families teetering on the brink of starvation or facing the agonizing prospect of debt slavery themselves would make the unthinkable decision to sell their youngest sons to unscrupulous traders who offered deceptive promises of apprenticeships or coveted household positions. The stark reality was infinitely darker. Kidnapping further swelled the supply, with ruthless raiders systematically targeting vulnerable communities residing on the fringes of Greek-controlled territory. Pirate ships prowled the Aegean Sea, their captains well aware that certain precious cargo commanded exorbitant prices in the shadowy underbelly of Athens' markets. The stark demographic realities are truly staggering. Historians estimate that slaves constituted a staggering 30–40% of Athens' total population during its zenith. Within this enslaved population, a horrifyingly significant percentage were children and adolescents, while precise figures remain frustratingly elusive due to the selective nature of historical record-keeping. The Greeks diligently documented every amphora of olive oil produced, yet remained conspicuously vague regarding their human property. Compelling evidence suggests that thousands of boys were funneled through this brutal system each and every year. Surreptitious training houses, thinly veiled as benevolent schools, meticulously prepared these innocent children for their assigned roles. Operated by jaded former courtesans and slaves who had simply aged out of desirability, these establishments drilled the boys to flawlessly recite poetry, master musical instruments, and perfect the thousand subtle gestures and inflections designed to please their future owners. They were painstakingly taught to pour wine with impeccable grace, to laugh at precisely the right moments, and above all, to silently endure whatever unspeakable acts would be demanded of them. The final devastating act was the branding, a permanent mark seared into their tender flesh, sometimes prominently displayed on the forehead, sometimes discreetly hidden on the hand, that irrevocably declared them as mere property. Different houses employed distinct symbols. A small delta signified ownership by the state, while private marks denoted individual owners. These brands served a chilling dual purpose: instant identification and ultimate dehumanization. Once branded, a boy was stripped of all legal personhood under Greek law. He was reduced to a mere object, a soulless thing to be used and discarded at whim. The horrific transformation from innocent child to disposable commodity was complete, and for the wealthy buyers eagerly waiting in the bustling agora, morality was relegated to an abstract philosophical exercise, certainly not a tangible barrier to their insatiable depraved desires. The symposium, that celebrated institution of Greek intellectual life, the supposed birthplace of philosophy and the crucible of democratic ideals, concealed dark secrets that most historical accounts have conveniently omitted, if not outright suppressed. Yes, these exclusive gatherings served as forums where educated men engaged in lively discourse on politics, poetry, and the fundamental nature of existence. But they were also, in undeniable fact, venues where the sexual exploitation of enslaved boys was not only permitted, but actively encouraged, even tacitly expected. Imagine the scene. A lavish private home nestled within Athens' most affluent district, the Andron, the designated men's room, meticulously prepared for the evening's debauchery. Couches were strategically arranged in a precise square formation, tables overflowed with tantalizing wine and decadent delicacies, and the walls were adorned with graphic frescoes that left absolutely no room for ambiguity regarding the evening's intended activities. The esteemed citizen guests would arrive promptly at dusk, elegantly reclining on their assigned couches, eagerly anticipating an evening of cultured conversation. And then the boys would silently appear. They entered bearing heavy wine jugs, their youthful bodies glistening with perfumed oil, clad in brief, revealing tunics that left very little to the imagination. These were the cupbearers, the entertainers, the evening's diversions. Their ages typically ranged from a tender 12 to a vulnerable 18, although some were demonstrably younger. They moved through the opulent room with practiced grace, born of constant repetition, meticulously filling cups, responding to every beckoning call, and enduring wandering hands with vacant expressions that betrayed the weight of repeated trauma. The progression of these depraved evenings followed a depressingly predictable pattern. As the potent wine flowed freely and inhibitions rapidly dissolved, what initially presented itself as elevated philosophical discourse inexorably devolved into something infinitely darker and more sinister. The boys were expected to entertain, to dance, to sing, and to silently submit to whatever degrading demands were made of them. Refusal invariably meant swift and brutal punishment. Compliance, however agonizing, offered the barest sliver of hope for survival. The symposium's host often provided these boys as a fundamental element of his hospitality, in much the same way that one might graciously offer a particularly rare vintage of wine or a selection of imported delicacies. Contemporary accounts, when they even bothered to acknowledge the presence of these boys at all, did so in a fleeting, dismissive manner, as if their existence was as unremarkable as the surrounding furniture. Xenophon casually mentioned symposiums where the evening's entertainment included strikingly beautiful boys performing elaborate acrobatic feats. Plato's Symposium, that philosophical masterpiece exploring the multifaceted nature of love, is set against the backdrop of just such a gathering, although he meticulously sanitizes any mention of the darker undercurrents. Archaeological evidence, however, proves far less discreet. Pottery shards and faded frescoes depict explicit scenes that leave absolutely no doubt as to what transpired behind closed doors. The very terminology employed reveals the normalized horror. Pais, the simple Greek word for boy, became synonymous with nothing more than a readily available sexual object. Eromenos, meaning the beloved, served as a thinly veiled euphemism for a boy trapped in a sexual relationship with an adult man. This insidious language effectively wrapped raw exploitation in the deceptive rhetoric of mentorship and affection, enabling participants to maintain their carefully cultivated self-image as cultured, civilized men, while simultaneously engaging in acts of systematic, egregious abuse. But what happened when the symposium finally drew to a close and the esteemed guests eventually departed into the Athenian night? The boys quietly retreated to their designated quarters, often cramped, unsanitary spaces nestled within the household slave area, to silently await the next summons. A fortunate few might manage to capture the fleeting affection of a wealthy patron who would eventually grant them their freedom, but the vast majority simply endured day after agonizing day until they aged out of their perceived desirability, at which point they faced an uncertain future as menial household slaves, unskilled laborers, or, if they had managed to internalize their brutal lessons with sufficient effectiveness, as procurers of the next vulnerable generation of victims. This was the agonizing reality that lay concealed behind those celebrated gatherings where democracy supposedly took its first tentative steps. Within the very same rooms where men earnestly debated concepts of justice and virtue, countless children suffered in excruciating silence, their pain dismissed as simply the natural order of things. Ancient Greece did not merely passively tolerate the sexual exploitation of young boys, it deliberately constructed an elaborate, all-encompassing cultural framework designed specifically to justify and perpetually perpetuate it. This horrific practice was neither hidden nor considered shameful. It was openly celebrated within art, meticulously justified within philosophical discourse, and rigidly codified within social customs that rendered meaningful resistance virtually impossible. The concept of pederasty, derived from the Greek words pais, boy, and erastis, lover, was cunningly dressed in the palatable language of education and mentorship. Influential philosophers argued that relationships between adult men and impressionable boys were not only inherently noble, but absolutely essential for a boy's proper development into a virtuous contributing citizen, conveniently disregarding the undeniable fact that these boys were almost exclusively slaves or impoverished lower-class youths who possessed absolutely no agency to refuse. The erastis, the adult lover, was ostensibly tasked with guiding his eromenos, his boy beloved, towards the attainment of wisdom and moral virtue. The reality, of course, was far more brutal. It was systematic grooming, meticulously orchestrated and fiercely reinforced by both pervasive social pressure and deeply entrenched legal authority. Art and literature further solidified and amplified these dehumanizing norms. Pottery from this period, of which thousands of pieces have miraculously survived, explicitly depicts graphic scenes of men engaging with boys, often within the supposed context of educational or athletic settings. These shocking images were not furtively hidden away within private collections. They were openly displayed, casually given as gifts, and utilized within daily life. The chilling message was undeniably clear. This is normal. This is acceptable. This is integral to Greek civilization. Esteemed poets composed odes to the ethereal beauty of boys, comparing them to revered gods and legendary heroes. Even respected medical texts soberly discussed the proper age for boys to initiate such relationships, as if such profound abuse could somehow be clinically optimized. The gymnasium, that celebrated institution of Greek education and physical development, became a veritable hunting ground for predatory men. Here, where young men exercised in the nude, the very word gymnasium derives from the Greek term gymnos, meaning naked. Wealthy citizens would discreetly observe and carefully select their future targets. The idealized athletic physique, the epitome of a young, muscular body, became relentlessly sexualized to the point where boys would meticulously oil their bodies, not merely for athletic competition, but specifically for heightened visual display. Trainers often functioned as willing intermediaries, facilitating introductions between promising boys and potential patrons. The legal structures of the time provided absolutely no meaningful protection. Slaves were stripped of all fundamental rights under Athenian law. They were legally barred from testifying in court, were utterly powerless to refuse their master's desires, and could not seek any semblance of justice for even the most egregious abuses. Even freeborn boys hailing from impoverished families possessed scant recourse. While the law technically prohibited the blatant prostitution of freeborn citizen boys, enforcement was notoriously lax, and penalties were often laughably light. For enslaved boys, however, there were absolutely no legal restrictions whatsoever. They were considered mere property, and as such, that property could be freely used in whatever manner the owner deemed fit. Even religious practices provided another readily available avenue for blatant exploitation. Certain cults incorporated ritual prostitution, where boys served directly within temples, offering their bodies to devout worshippers as an integral element of religious observance. The cult of Aphrodite at Corinth was particularly notorious for such practices. Sacred and profane intertwined in a deeply disturbing system that transformed abuse from something merely acceptable into something overtly holy. The philosophical justifications were perhaps the most insidiously dangerous of all. Plato's dialogues, for example, earnestly discuss love between men and boys as the highest possible form of human affection, inherently superior to love between men and women. The Stoics, often hailed as paragons of iron self-control, saw absolutely no contradiction between their rigorous ethical code and their routine use of enslaved boys for sexual gratification. Even Aristotle, who wrote extensively on the complex concepts of ethics and virtue, freely owned slaves and saw nothing inherently wrong with the sexual use of enslaved children. These appalling mental gymnastics would almost be worthy of grudging admiration if the consequences were not so utterly horrific. This sophisticated cultural machinery operated with ruthless, unyielding efficiency. Every major institution, educational, religious, legal, philosophical, reinforced the exact same dehumanizing message. The bodies of certain boys existed solely for the pleasure of free adult men. To question this fundamental tenet was to directly challenge the very foundations upon which Greek society was built. And so it continued, unabated, generation after agonizing generation, a perpetual cycle of unspeakable abuse relentlessly cloaked in the self-righteous robes of civilization. History, as penned by the powerful, seldom preserves the authentic voices of the exploited. However, if we possess the necessary knowledge of where to meticulously search, legal documents, fragmented medical texts, graffiti furtively scratched onto walls, and, perhaps most crucially, between the carefully chosen lines of surviving literature, we can still discern haunting echoes of these boys' agonizing experiences. Their profound pain resonates across the vast chasm of millennia, demanding that we finally acknowledge its enduring truth. Court records from Athens occasionally make fleeting mention of slaves testifying under torture, the only legally sanctioned method by which a slave's evidence could be formally admitted. In one particularly chilling case dating back to the 4th century BCE, a boy named Pitolakos testified regarding the rampant abuse occurring within his master's household. The clinical transcript, dry and detached, notes almost as an afterthought that he had been used for purposes of pleasure since the tender age of 10. His tortured testimony was solely sought in the context of property theft. His own personal violation was deemed utterly irrelevant to the proceedings. He simply vanishes from the historical record after this single fleeting mention, his ultimate fate forever shrouded in mystery. Graffiti unearthed from Pompeii and other ancient sites offers surprisingly candid glimpses into these boys' tragically truncated lives. Scratched onto brothel walls and hidden back alleys, we find desperate messages such as, "Crescens the netmaker holds the hearts of all the girls and boys," along with far more explicit descriptions of particular boys' physical attributes and corresponding prices. Some of this graffiti appears to have been painstakingly etched by the boys themselves. Desperate pleas about long-lost families, crude drawings of their distant homes, and fragile attempts to record their own names before they were irrevocably forgotten. Medical texts, too, reveal the profound physical toll exacted. Greek physicians meticulously documented injuries that were unequivocally consistent with repeated sexual assault, although they invariably couched their clinical observations in sterile, detached language. Treatments for painful anal fissures, prolapses, and various sexually transmitted diseases appear with disturbing frequency in medical papyri, often specifically referencing young slaves. One physician matter-of-factly notes that such debilitating injuries were commonplace among household boys, casually recommending various soothing ointments and periods of enforced rest, while simultaneously acknowledging that masters rarely permitted adequate healing time. The few surviving literary works that tentatively hint at these boys' perspectives are heartbreaking in their very indirection. A poignant fragment from a lost comedic play mentions a slave boy who meticulously feigns muteness in a desperate attempt to avoid being forced to perform at symposiums. Another text describes a young boy who deliberately scars his own face to render himself less desirable. These instances are almost always presented as humorous anecdotes, transforming profound suffering into cheap entertainment for the very class that perpetrated it. Epitaphs etched onto humble grave markers provide some of the most hauntingly poignant evidence. Small stone markers for enslaved individuals occasionally include phrases such as "sweetest boy" or "beloved by his master," transparent euphemisms that strongly suggest sexual exploitation. One particularly haunting inscription uncovered in Athens reads simply, "Here lies Nicodemus, who lived 14 years, beautiful in form, pleasing in all ways to his master Diodorus." The devastating subtext is undeniably clear to anyone willing to truly see it. Perhaps most telling of all are the tragically high suicide rates. While precise statistics remain heartbreakingly impossible to determine, stark references to young slaves taking their own lives appear with deeply disturbing frequency, jumping from great heights, consuming deadly poison, and deliberately refusing nourishment. These desperate boys ultimately found their own irreversible ways to escape their unimaginable torment. One chilling account describes a young boy who threw himself into the unforgiving sea rather than return to his master's household, his lifeless body washing ashore days later, still bearing the telltale metal collar that branded him as mere property. Archaeological evidence provides another crucial layer of testimony. Mass graves of young slaves starkly reveal telltale signs of severe malnutrition, untreated injuries, and a multitude of diseases directly associated with systematic sexual abuse. Detailed skeletal analysis reveals clear patterns of growth stunting definitively, consistent with chronic stress and deep-seated trauma. These silent bones tell agonizing stories that written history has desperately attempted to silence. Even within their profound silence, these boys speak. The gaping holes within the historical record, the meticulously crafted omissions, the pervasive use of euphemisms, and the specific subjects that ancient writers consciously avoided collectively create a negative space that powerfully outlines the true extent of their prolonged suffering. What remains consciously unsaid often proves far more revealing than what is explicitly stated. The undeniable fact that so few direct accounts have managed to survive serves as stark evidence of a deliberate erasure, a collective agreement among the literate classes to steadfastly pretend that these boys' profound pain simply did not exist. The sexual trafficking of boys in ancient Greece functioned as a highly sophisticated, ruthlessly efficient economic system, complete with its own established markets, fluctuating prices, and intricate supply chains. Understanding the intricate business of exploitation reveals the truly alarming extent to which this abhorrent practice was woven into the very fabric of Greek society. This was not aberrant behavior confined to a handful of depraved individuals. Rather, it was a fully fledged, thriving industry that touched every imaginable level of the economy. Specialized dealers, known chillingly as paidopoli, boy sellers, openly operated within most major Greek cities. These were not shadowy figures lurking in the shadows. They were established merchants with well-maintained shops, reliable suppliers, and even their own professional trade associations. They meticulously maintained extensive networks that stretched across the entirety of the Mediterranean, collaborating with unscrupulous pirates, ruthless raiders, and cunning agents who specialized in procuring vulnerable boys from targeted populations. War invariably provided a lucrative windfall. In the aftermath of decisive military victories, thousands of newly orphaned children flooded the market, temporarily driving prices downward before demand inevitably reasserted itself. The meticulous pricing structure reveals the chilling commodification of these innocent children. Boys were coldly evaluated based on a specific set of dehumanizing criteria: age. Younger boys consistently commanded significantly higher prices, physical appearance, based on a detailed, highly subjective standard of beauty, overall health, and perceived trainability. Surviving market documents reveal shockingly elaborate categorization systems. A primo boy, young, remarkably beautiful, and demonstrably untouched, could fetch a price equivalent to that of a small productive farm. Boys displaying special talents, musical prowess, exceptional dancing ability, or remarkable wit commanded substantial premiums. Even factors such as skin tone, hair color, and the precise shape of particular body parts were meticulously cataloged and explicitly priced. Transportation presented its own brutal calculus. Boys were invariably moved in large groups, often physically chained together, aboard specially designed ships crafted to maximize profit per voyage. Mortality rates during these horrific transports were appallingly high. Disease, suicide born of despair, and rampant abuse at the hands of the ship's crew took a devastating toll. However, the immense profits generated by this trade were such that losing 20–30% of the cargo was coldly considered an acceptable loss. Those who miraculously survived this brutal journey arrived at their ultimate destinations weakened, traumatized, and significantly easier to control. Clandestine training facilities functioned as both brutal schools and systematic breaking grounds. Newly arrived boys were coldly assessed, rigorously sorted, and subjected to intense regimens specifically designed to produce compliant, highly skilled slaves. The methods employed were chillingly systematic: enforced isolation designed to sever family bonds, brutal punishment meted out for speaking native languages, and carefully calibrated rewards offered for the swift adoption of Greek customs. Older slaves, often former concubines themselves, oversaw this horrific process. They knew firsthand what would be expected of the boys and meticulously prepared them accordingly. The pervasive financial ecosystem extended far beyond the direct sale of human beings. Lending houses openly offered lines of credit to finance the purchase of exceptionally valuable boys, charging exorbitant interest rates that would be deemed usurious even by ancient standards. Sophisticated insurance policies covered valuable slaves against accidental death or daring escape attempts. Specialized legal services crafted meticulously worded contracts that explicitly spelled out the precise terms of usage, including what specific acts were permitted and what level of financial compensation would be due should a boy be damaged beyond his intended usefulness. Overt rental markets added yet another disturbing dimension to the pervasive exploitation. While not everyone could afford to purchase a boy outright, many could easily afford to rent one for a single evening or even an entire season. Brothels explicitly specializing in young boys openly operated within most Greek cities, their locations known to all. Private parties could easily arrange for boys to be discreetly delivered for exclusive events, with pricing meticulously scaled according to the number of expected guests and the projected duration of use. Some establishments even offered structured membership arrangements, allowing privileged regular access to a rotating selection of young boys. The insidious integration with legitimate businesses was effectively complete. Taverns and inns routinely kept boys on hand to attract affluent customers. Theatrical troupes invariably included young boys who would perform both on stage and within private arrangements. Even some ostensibly religious sanctuaries profited directly from boy prostitutes, rationalizing this pervasive exploitation as a unique service offered to the gods. The already blurred line between legal commerce and egregious sexual exploitation was effectively erased to the point of complete invisibility. Cutthroat competition fueled continuous innovation within this horrific market. Dealers aggressively advertised their unique stock, imported exotic boys from distant lands, and even offered guarantees of satisfaction. Some dealers specialized in particular types. Thracian boys were marketed as exceptionally hardy and enduring. Egyptians were touted as mysterious and deeply skilled in the ancient arts, and Gauls were aggressively branded as naturally wild and passionate. The chilling marketing language found within surviving documents reads disturbingly like modern livestock catalogs, callously reducing complex human beings to nothing more than interchangeable lists of desirable attributes and potential uses. When boys inevitably aged out of their perceived desirability, typically by their late teens, their market value plummeted precipitously. Some were retained as basic household slaves, while others were sold off cheaply for use in unskilled manual labor. A select few who had fully internalized the brutal lessons of the trade themselves became procurers, knowingly perpetuating the horrific cycle of exploitation. The luckiest among them might be freed by masters who had developed genuine affection, although freedom for a former sex slave within Greek society meant a life marred by inescapable stigma and severely limited opportunities. This relentless economic machinery ground on for centuries, relentlessly processing countless young lives into raw profit. It directly supported merchants, trainers, transporters, guards, and a vast number of others who actively made their living from the profound suffering of innocent children. When we proudly speak of the Greek economic miracle, we must never forget that it was built, in no small part, upon this deeply disturbing foundation of systematized abuse. Not every boy quietly submitted to his predetermined fate, despite facing overwhelming power structures meticulously designed to crush their spirit. Many desperately sought ways to resist, to survive, or to carve out small pockets of fragile autonomy within their nightmare existence. Their individual stories of quiet defiance, although often ending in tragic loss, serve as powerful reminders that even within the darkest possible circumstances, the indomitable human spirit persistently seeks freedom. Physical resistance, though undeniably dangerous, was not uncommon. Archaeological evidence and scattered written accounts reference instances of boys physically fighting back, biting, scratching, and even wielding improvised weapons against their abusers. The punishments meted out for such blatant defiance were invariably severe: savage whipping, deliberate starvation, prolonged isolation within underground cells, or permanent mutilation. One chilling account describes a boy who bravely attacked his master with a simple kitchen knife. He was subsequently crucified in the household courtyard as a stark example to all the others. Yet, despite the near certainty of agonizing consequences, some desperate boys knowingly chose violent resistance over dehumanizing submission. Far more prevalent were subtle forms of calculated sabotage. Boys would deliberately break expensive items, spoil valuable wine, or perform their assigned duties just poorly enough to frustrate their masters without provoking overly severe punishment. Some learned to convincingly feign illness. Medical texts mention masters bitterly complaining about boys who frequently claimed debilitating stomach pains or persistent headaches in a calculated attempt to avoid service. Others deliberately developed revolting skin conditions through systematic neglect of personal hygiene, rendering themselves significantly less desirable for intimate services. Psychological resistance took countless forms. Some boys created elaborate internal fantasy worlds, deliberately dissociating themselves from their horrific physical reality. Others forged covert bonds with fellow slaves, creating surrogate families that provided much-needed emotional support. They developed coded languages, subtle hand gestures, and secret meeting places where they could freely share their pain within the relative safety of the slave quarters after dark. They shared cherished stories of their distant homelands, desperately attempting to keep alive precious memories that their masters sought to eradicate. Religious and spiritual practices offered yet another crucial avenue for quiet resistance. Many boys tenaciously clung to the gods of their homelands, praying in secret and diligently maintaining forbidden rituals. Some desperately turned to esoteric mystery cults that promised salvation in the afterlife, a beacon of hope for those whose current lives offered only unending suffering. Others embraced philosophical ideas that emphasized the inherent nature of internal freedom, even in the face of external bondage, finding solace within Stoic or Cynic teachings that provided a framework for psychological survival. The carefully cultivated formation of protective networks among slaves reveals remarkable resilience. Older slaves often took younger ones under their protective wing, teaching them essential survival strategies and shielding them whenever possible from the worst excesses of abuse. Kitchen slaves would surreptitiously ensure that extra food made its way to the boys' quarters. Trusted house slaves would issue hushed warnings about masters who were in particularly violent moods. These complex networks operated through subtle signals and unspoken agreements, remaining virtually invisible to the free population, but serving as a lifeline for those trapped within the system. Some boys managed to survive through the cultivation of exceptional talents that provided them with a measure of leverage. A boy blessed with a stunning singing voice might negotiate slightly better treatment in exchange for performing at significant social gatherings. Those who displayed exceptional wit and intelligence sometimes became valued as conversationalists as much as physical objects, gaining a slight measure of protection through their keen mental abilities. A select few even managed to acquire rudimentary reading and writing skills that could eventually lead to administrative positions, offering a degree of autonomy. Escape attempts, though rarely successful, never truly ceased. Boys painstakingly memorized city layouts, meticulously hoarded small items that could be traded for vital food, and vigilantly waited for a fleeting opportunity to strike. Most who dared to flee were quickly recaptured, their brands rendering them instantly identifiable, and the generous rewards offered for the return of escaped slaves provided a powerful incentive for their swift apprehension. Captured escapees faced brutal punishments, additional branding, cruel hamstringing designed to prevent future attempts or sail to even harsher conditions. Yet, the brutal knowledge of these devastating consequences did not deter desperate boys from risking everything in pursuit of freedom. The profound psychological toll of sustained abuse manifested in countless ways. Some boys retreated into complete silence, effectively becoming mute. Others developed what modern psychology would recognize as dissociative disorders, deliberately creating alternate personalities to better cope with the overwhelming trauma. Self-harm was tragically common. Cutting, burning, and other forms of deliberate injury that provided a measure of control over their own violated bodies. Many turned to readily available wine or other mind-numbing substances in a desperate search for oblivion. For those who miraculously survived to adulthood, the agonizing scars, both physical and psychological, inevitably remained. Freed slaves who had previously served as concubines faced a lifetime of pervasive stigma that followed them wherever they went. Many could never successfully form healthy relationships, their capacity for trust and intimacy irrevocably destroyed. Some sadly became abusers themselves, unknowingly perpetuating the cycle of violence, while others retreated into profound isolation, unable to integrate meaningfully into society even when granted the opportunity to do so. Yet even amidst all this seemingly impenetrable darkness, unexpected moments of genuine humanity occasionally emerged. Stories persist of boys who managed to maintain their capacity for profound kindness, who protected even younger slaves, and who found fleeting ways to create beauty even within the confines of their bondage. Some learned to skillfully play musical instruments and compose moving songs that, though sadly lost to the ravages of history, provided precious moments of transcendence. Others transformed themselves into storytellers, carefully keeping alive treasured tales of better times and better places. These individual stories of resistance and remarkable survival challenge the often repeated historical narrative that presents these boys merely as passive victims. They were undeniably human beings who valiantly fought in whatever ways they could against a dehumanizing system meticulously designed to obliterate their fundamental humanity. Their profound courage, even when it led directly to further punishment or even agonizing death, stands as a timeless testament to the unbreakable human desire for both dignity and freedom. How do we possibly reconcile the Athens that gifted the world democracy, philosophy, and the very foundations of Western thought with the Athens that simultaneously and systematically abused its most vulnerable children? This agonizing cognitive dissonance has led to centuries of calculated historical whitewashing. However, a thorough examination of this troubling contradiction reveals vitally important truths regarding how societies can so readily compartmentalize evil while simultaneously celebrating their own perceived virtue. The very same city that produced Socrates' profound ethical inquiries also openly operated brutal slave markets, where innocent children were coldly bought and sold like mere livestock. Plato's esteemed academy, where the very theory of ideal forms was painstakingly developed, stood only miles away from clandestine brothels filled with enslaved boys. Aristotle, who penned volumes on the complex concepts of virtue and the good life, saw no inherent contradiction in personally owning slaves and actively defending the practice as both natural and necessary. The iconic Parthenon, that globally recognized symbol of classical beauty and perfect proportion, was itself constructed partly with wealth directly generated from the horrific human trafficking trade. This was not born of simple ignorance or primitive thinking. Greek philosophers were undeniably capable of extraordinary moral reasoning, particularly when it suited their own deeply self-serving purposes. They vigorously debated justice, meticulously analyzed virtue, and constructed elaborate ethical systems of remarkable sophistication. However, when it came to the blatant exploitation of slaves, particularly young slaves, their moral blindness was effectively absolute. They skillfully deployed their formidable intellectual gifts, not to thoughtfully question the prevailing system, but rather to vehemently justify it, creating elaborate arguments for why certain categories of humans were naturally suited for eternal slavery and routine sexual use. The very concept of democracy itself reveals the fundamentally hollow nature of Athenian enlightenment. Yes, Athens undeniably pioneered the concept of democratic governance. However, this democracy explicitly excluded women, slaves, and foreign residents, effectively the vast majority of the population. The leisured citizens who gathered in the agora to thoughtfully debate policy were directly supported by the forced labor and brutalized bodies of the enslaved. Their own freedom to leisurely pursue philosophy and engaging politics was directly built upon the unending bondage of countless others. The systemic sexual abuse of enslaved boys was not merely incidental to Athenian democracy. It was an indispensable component of the carefully constructed social structure that made it all possible. Cultural production further reinforced these troubling contradictions. The same lauded poets who wrote so movingly about themes of justice and transcendent beauty also penned shockingly callous verses brazenly celebrating the rape of young boys, cleverly cloaking raw abuse in the palatable language of romantic love and virtuous mentorship. Skilled sculptors crafted idealized images of youthful male beauty that simultaneously served as both breathtaking artistic achievements and thinly veiled advertisements for rampant sexual exploitation. The theater, the undisputed birthplace of both tragic drama and biting comedy, routinely featured crude jokes regarding pederasty that effectively normalized heinous abuse through casual humor. Education, supposedly the indispensable cornerstone of Athenian excellence, was deeply implicated within the insidious system. The gymnasium and palestra, where privileged freeborn boys learned the revered arts of athletics and civic virtue, were also fertile hunting grounds where they were explicitly taught to see the routine sexual use of slaves as perfectly normal and even subtly encouraged. Elite education routinely included attendance at symposiums, where privileged boys directly witnessed the systematic abuse of their enslaved peers, insidiously internalizing harmful hierarchies of human worth. They were diligently taught both philosophy and exploitation simultaneously, seeing no apparent contradiction between the two. The religious dimension adds yet another disturbing layer of pervasive hypocrisy. Greeks zealously honored gods who, according to their own sacred myths, routinely raped mortal women and boys. Zeus's unending conquests, Apollo's incessant pursuits of attractive young men, and a myriad of other divine sexual predations provided ready-made sacred justification for deeply rooted earthly abuse. Religious festivals sometimes included the explicitly ritualized prostitution of young boys, transforming egregious abuse from something merely permissible into something overtly holy. The very same culture that painstakingly created the transformative Eleusinian mysteries, promising its initiates profound spiritual enlightenment, saw no apparent conflict in systematically destroying the spirits of its defenseless enslaved children. Even Greek medicine, rightfully celebrated for its remarkably empirical approach and its adherence to stringent ethical standards, tragically failed these vulnerable boys. The Hippocratic Oath's foundational injunction to first do no harm seemingly did not extend to those suffering from debilitating injuries directly caused by the rampant sexual abuse of slaves. Physicians meticulously documented and routinely treated such injuries without ever meaningfully questioning their root cause or actively advocating on behalf of the traumatized victims. Medical knowledge undeniably advanced, in part, through detailed observations of these brutalized and traumatized bodies, but this knowledge was never effectively utilized to meaningfully prevent such profound trauma from occurring in the first place. The legal system, despite its impressively sophisticated development of complex concepts such as trial by jury and the fundamental presumption of innocence, offered absolutely no meaningful protection to enslaved boys. Laws explicitly regulating slavery rigidly focused on defending and expanding property rights, not on recognizing or protecting basic human rights. A master who deliberately killed his own slave might face some measure of fleeting social disapproval, but rarely ever had to contend with serious legal consequences. The rape of a slave was not even considered a crime. It was merely the standard utilization of owned property. The very same legal minds that developed such complex and compelling arguments regarding the concepts of justice and proper governance seemingly viewed enslaved children as existing entirely outside the accepted realm of legal protection. Modern defenders of classical civilization often argue that we cannot fairly judge ancient societies through the decidedly biased lens of contemporary standards. However, this argument readily falls apart when we acknowledge that even within Greek society itself, some courageous voices bravely questioned the inherent morality of slavery and widespread abuse. The Cynics actively challenged rigid social hierarchies, while some sophists persuasively argued for the fundamental equality of all human beings. These courageous minority voices undeniably prove that widespread moral blindness was ultimately a conscious choice, not an unavoidable limitation imposed by the inescapable constraints of that historical era. The deeply troubling legacy of this compartmentalization continues to haunt us today. The deeply ingrained tendency to celebrate monumental cultural achievements while simultaneously ignoring the pervasive atrocities occurring alongside them did not abruptly end with the decline of ancient Greece. How many societies, even now, actively produce magnificent art and towering literature while simultaneously perpetrating the systematic abuse of their most vulnerable citizens? How many develop elaborate justifications for profoundly harmful practices that they innately know, on some fundamental level, are undeniably wrong? The Athenian example serves as a stark warning that cultural sophistication and true moral progress are decidedly not one and the same. When we rigorously study classical Greece, we must resolutely hold both these competing truths firmly in our conscious mind. This profoundly influential civilization made undeniably remarkable contributions to human thought and global culture, and yet it simultaneously built those achievements upon a deeply disturbing foundation of horrific exploitation. The countless boys who needlessly suffered within Athenian brothels and at exploitative symposiums were every bit as real as the esteemed philosophers who gathered in the agora. Their profound pain directly subsidized the intellectual enlightenment of others. To fully acknowledge this painful truth does not somehow diminish the inherent value of Greek philosophy or the undeniable importance of democratic ideals. Rather, it only serves to complete our true understanding of what those achievements ultimately cost. The exploitation of vulnerable children did not somehow magically end with the inevitable fall of classical civilization. As we rigorously examine modern-day human trafficking, pervasive institutional abuse, and the insidious ways in which entrenched power structures continue to enable predatory behavior, the disquieting parallels with ancient Greece become disturbingly clear. Understanding these enduring connections is not about lazily engaging in moral relativism. It is fundamentally about recognizing that the inherent human capacity for systematized abuse tragically transcends the barriers of both time and culture. Today's sprawling global human trafficking industry generates billions of dollars in illicit profit directly from the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children. Much like the ancient Greek slave markets, modern trafficking operations function through highly sophisticated networks that meticulously procure, efficiently transport, and brazenly sell human beings for profit. While the precise methods employed may have necessarily evolved, slick internet platforms now frequently replace crude physical markets, and anonymizing cryptocurrencies facilitate opaque transactions. The fundamental economic drivers sadly remain largely unchanged. Endemic poverty, widespread conflict, and pervasive social marginalization continue to create seemingly endless supplies of vulnerable children for those with both the money and power to systematically exploit them. The insidious grooming techniques employed in ancient Greece find direct parallels in the disturbing behaviors of modern-day predators. Just as ancient Greek philosophers expertly cloaked their heinous abuse in the palatable language of virtuous mentorship and education, many of today's most prolific predators skillfully position themselves as benevolent benefactors, trusted teachers, or caring protectors. They meticulously identify exceptionally vulnerable targets. So, as we've seen, the gleaming facade of ancient Athens, that cradle of democracy and philosophy, concealed a chilling truth: the systematic sexual exploitation of children. By confronting this uncomfortable reality, we gain a deeper, more honest understanding of history and, crucially, a sharpened awareness of the enduring potential for exploitation, no matter how cleverly it's masked. The story of those countless unnamed boys, silenced for so long, compels us to examine our own societies, to question the justifications for inequality, and to relentlessly challenge any system that commodifies human life. What are your thoughts on this complex piece of history? Did anything we discussed particularly resonate with you? Please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your perspectives, answer any questions you might have, and continue this vital conversation together. And if you found this video thought-provoking, please consider subscribing to the channel. We'll be diving into more untold stories and hidden corners of history, and I wouldn't want you to miss out. Thanks for watching.